the Jewish Historical Society. I'm Joe Murray, and the person that I'm with is Howard Goldberg. The reason why I chose to interview Howie is because he has been associated with the Jewish community for a great number of years, and I'm sure he'll have a lot of anecdotal comments and stories to tell us. Howie, you're on your own.
Thank you, Joe. My name is Howie Goldberg, and I'm going to talk about the Goldberg family, my late father's family, who came over to Canada. There was my late grandfather, his wife, his mother, and 3 children. Came over about 94 years ago. So it would have been the early 1900s, I guess about 1905, 1906. At the time they came over, there were the 3 eldest children. There was Abe, who settled eventually in Montreal. There was Tilly, who settled in New York and married an American, and they eventually moved on to Florida for their latter years. And the third one, who was born in Europe, was you know what? Better stop it for a second. I realized I made a mistake. It was only those 2 children came over with the adults from Russia. They came from a town in Russia. Unfortunately, I don't know the name. In this country, they moved to Montreal because my grandfather, they settled in Montreal because my grandfather knew a Launcelite who was living there, and he helped him get a job. Unfortunately, a short time after he started working, he got injured on the job and was let go. This friend of his suggested that they move to Smiths Falls, a small town, where he could get a job with a CPR, which was, Smiths Falls was the hub of the railway network at that time. So they packed up and moved to Montreal, to Smiths Falls from Montreal. In Smiths Falls, another 7 children were born. The next one, or the first one born in Smiths Falls, was my late father, Ben. And then there were a number of other children who followed. My grandfather got a job with the railway, and it was basically, he was a mechanic. He did repairs on trains and tracks and so on. It was a hard life, and believe me, he didn't make very much money. But it was satisfying. They had a little house and a piece of land, and they settled. Shortly after the 9th child was born, and she today is about 78 years old, my grandmother, that would be my father's mother, died suddenly. In those days, they said it was high blood pressure, but it was probably a stroke or something heart-related. Died and left the 9 children, the eldest of whom was about 19 or 20 years old, right down to a baby. And my late great-grandmother, who was my father's bubby, and my grandfather's mother, he was an only child, took over raising the family. She was an ultra-Orthodox lady who wore a sheitel all the time. And in those days, a sheitel was made of, the base, the underneath part was made of ceramic or something very, very heavy, so that the thing weighed a ton on her head. But she wore it until the last 2 or 3 years of her life, which was the early 40s. And then she was getting very feeble, so her grandchildren, whom she raised basically as her children, made her take it off, and she wore a tichel on her head for the rest of her life. As the children grew, the older ones moved away, and the rest of them in the meantime stayed in Smiths Falls. My father worked with my grandfather. They eventually set up a junk business, and my dad had an old Ford pickup truck that he used to pick up junk, and then they would sell it. And a couple of the sisters opened up a little dress shop in Smiths Falls. One of the brothers, as he got a little bit older, joined the Air Force and eventually served during the Army and the Air Force. And the youngest sister moved to New York to be with 2 other sisters who lived in New York at the time. Most of them got married and had families. There was one sister who never married. Her name was Zelda. She passed away a year after my father, but a year ago, the first day of Pesach. And but they worked hard, but they had a good life. I remember their home when they still had their wood-burning stove and their outdoor plumbing, and it was really, for a kid today to see it, they would really think it was the Dark Ages. And my grandfather, who was also very frum, had a Torah in his house, and their house was used as a base for a shul. They didn't have services. I don't think they had services every Shabbos, but they did have services on the all Yom Tov, when Yisker had to be said, and if somebody had Yortzeit, then they made sure there was a minyan. And I remember as a child, when we'd go down to Smith Falls to visit, running up the stairs to make sure that the Torah, which was in a box, which I guess served as the Aron Kodesh, was still there intact. And the Torah was there until after my grandfather passed away, and then it was donated to Perth, because at the time Perth had some sort of a shul, and they were running services. So that's one of my first memories. And then over the years after my grandfather passed away, one of my aunts and uncles who had stayed in the business in Smith Falls enlarged the house and modernized it, and we used to go down for barbecues, and they had a swimming pool in the backyard. Smith Falls unfortunately never grew very much as a Jewish community. I think at max it might have had 10 or 12 families. But my Zayd Abel Shulam used to come to Ottawa, dubbed at Machziki Hadass, and used to stay with the late Mrs. Drazen. That was Mima Drazen, who lived on Clarence or Murray Street.
Murray.
And he used to stay with her, and it was, as a result, he and the Drazen family and the Steinman family became very, very good friends. Well, my father used to come to Ottawa periodically, and one day he saw my mother from the distance, and he fell in love with her at first sight. Being a very shy individual that he was, it took him some time, but he eventually got up the courage and asked my mother out. And my mother, who was Eileen Rivers, eventually asked my father, or my father asked her, that's the joke of the family, and inevitably they did get married in June 21st, 1942. And at the time my father was still doing work in Smith Falls, so they moved back to Smith Falls, and I was born next year in 1943 in August 19th, and I was born here in the Ottawa Civic Hospital, but we lived in Smith Falls. And when I reached the age of about 2.5, 3, my parents decided it was time to move to Ottawa, where there was a Jewish community, and I could go to Jewish school, Cheder, at the time, and be raised as amongst Jewish people. At the same time, my brother was born, my brother Stanley. We did move to Ottawa, and of course, my father had really very little at the time, financially speaking. So we moved in with my late grandparents, my Bubby and Zadie, Jacob and Leah Rivers, who lived at 155, I believe, Clarence Street. Now it's a city parking lot. But they had a big, big house on Clarence Street where they had raised their family, and we lived with them for 2 or 3 years. And I remember the house that the living room was at the front, and then you went to the back, which was the kitchen, which was a huge, huge room. There was a set of stairs that led upstairs through the kitchen. And the kitchen in those days, I think in most Jewish homes, was the room where everybody gathered. And I have very, very weak but fond memories of that house, and climbing the stairs to go to bed and so on. And we had neighbors next door. We had French people who lived next door, the Charon family, who most of the sons became policemen, and they used to babysit my brother and myself. And on the other side of us lived the Gorn family, Honey Gorn and her sister Anne, who's Anne Toller, and she's Honey Monson, and they used to babysit. And to this day they say I was the most beautiful little baby that they ever saw. And so my parents lived there for a few years, and my dad bought a clothing store on William Street, which I don't remember the address. The only thing I remember is that Harry Zuckerman had it afterwards. And my dad eked out a living in that. And then after a few years doing that, he went into J. Rivers Fruit with my uncle, the late Irving Rivers, and they were partners in the fruit business, but physically it was just too difficult for my father to stay in it. So he went into the hide business, buying hides, which he was familiar with from doing it in Smith Falls. And he used to take the hides, and very often I'd go with him in the truck, and he'd sell them to Norman Kizzle at his plant or factory, whatever you want to call it, which stunk to high hell. And the flies, there must have been a million flies flying around. And I'd sit in the truck while Dad would do his business with Norman. And then I guess things got a little bit better, and my parents bought a triplex on Daly Avenue, 411 Daly Avenue, which at one time had belonged to one of the prominent Ottawa families, and they had converted it from a house into a triplex. In that area, there were a lot of beautiful big old homes that families had eventually converted into duplexes, triplexes, and so on. I don't remember which family owned ours. And we lived there happily for many years. I was fortunate enough that my parents were amongst the first number of families who insisted on providing us with a Jewish parochial day school. And there was a core group of parents, including mine, the late Marion and Hy Besson, Mrs. Ellen Lithwick, my Aunt Thelma Steinman, and a few others. Unfortunately, I don't know all the names at the moment, but they canvassed and fought for a day school. And they went to the late Alex Betcherman and the members of the Talmud Torah board and asked them if they would provide them with a room in the Talmud Torah building that they could start a day school. And their answer was, no, there was no need for a day school, but we had an excellent Talmud Torah in Ottawa. They wouldn't give us space and they wouldn't give them money. So these determined people started holding teas and rummage sales until they had raised enough money to pay the rent for a room. And in 1940, I believe it was about 1948 or 9, Hillel Academy, then known as the Ottawa Hebrew Day School, was started at the old Talmud Torah building that existed on Rideau Street. I was about 6 years old when I started grade 1. We had kindergarten, which ran through the Talmud Torah with the late Mrs. Kravitz. And then we started grade 1, and we had the late Mr. Bauer was our Hebrew teacher, and I think he taught grade 1 right through for the next 40 to 50 years, because I know my children, who are now 28 and 26, had him in grade 1 as well. And the day school has grown. Eventually, they started off with 13 children, and 10 of us graduated in 1956. So as I went to Hillel Academy, which was on Rideau. In those days, was the Ottawa Hebrew Day School. We used to walk downtown very often. One of our favorite ploys was after school. We were 5 boys, and we would either walk or take the streetcar and go into Freeman's, A.J. Freeman's, and go downstairs and have a malted milk. That was our treat. And, you know, in those days you could walk around Rideau Street, and every store that was there was privately owned and Jewish owned, or 99% of them were. It was, you know, there was Saul Max's, there was L. Fine and Company, there was the Feller Brothers, Kaplan's. One of the few stores there that wasn't Jewish owned was Ogilvy's, and I think in the early days they didn't like the Jews anyhow. They were very anti-Semitic. And then, of course, if you walked on the market, I think every store on the market was Jewish owned at the time, besides the peddlers who came and bought from the Jewish merchants on the market and then went out peddling their goods. It's something that, unfortunately, I guess we'll never see again, but the memories of it are just wonderful. Well, there was Sasso, who was on George Street with his boxer. Yeah, he was, and he was there until just a few years ago. So there was Lithwick's. They called it Economy Clothing. There was Wiener's Clothing. You went up William Street. Almost everybody there was Jewish. There was Jack Steinberg, and there was Harry Zuckerman. There was Beck Steinberg, who ran her late husband, Harry Steinberg's clothing store. Louis Kevenstein. Really, just about everybody was Jewish. One of the things was that in those days we used to daven at King Street Shul or Murray Street Shul, or there was Rita Street Shul, and usually for a break the kids we'd pre-arrange it to get together and we'd walk downtown. And on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, it was the most wonderful sight. You'd walk downtown and every single store that was Jewish owned was closed with a sign in the window, closed due to Jewish New Year. It was really just very, very fascinating. Yes, too, there was the pawnbroker stores with their overhead hanging sign with the three balls. I think it was the Wieners had, that was Isaac Wiener, and his boys had that.
And then there was the jokes, that he got arrested because he had his balls hanging out.
Oh, that I didn't know.
Yeah.
It could have very well happened. It could have very well happened. My dad, who was in business for many years, afterwards also was in the gift shop business, had giftware in China. They started on Bank Street, and then their last many years they were on Rideau Street near Dalhousie. There was Laroque's, which also, believe it or not, was owned by Jews. And now when you look around there, there's really almost nobody left in the Jewish retail business. We had milkmen used to come to our doors in those days. I remember that on Daly Avenue, that after the milkmen had been by, there were the horse left their marks on every street, and you had to tiptoe in and out if you were on the road to make sure you didn't mush it up and so on and so forth. I remember as a very young child, my father would take me on Sunday mornings to get fresh hot bread, and I recall two bakeries in particular. One was owned by the Mossians, which was on Rose Street, and the Cardish family, who owned the Rideau Bakery one, which was you could get in off Murray or York Street.
Clarence.
It was Clarence Street was the second street, and you'd walk in, and the heat would drive you crazy, but the smell of the bread was just phenomenal. And it's being recalled to me that there was a third bakery at the time that was owned by the Bodnow family. But to go in there, you talk about getting fresh bread, but to go into one of those places on a Sunday morning, that was heaven. That was heaven. And in those days, Jewish people did everything. They owned the store. There were lots of them who worked in stores. There were some who were struggling to sell life insurance, some who struggled to become accountants. People weren't proud because most of them had families, and you did whatever you had to put a roof over their heads and to feed them. At one time, too, I think down in that area, Lower Town area, there were at least 3 or 4 butcher shops. I remember Cantor's having the one on St. Patrick Street. I even worked there for a summer. There was Halpern had one on Friel Street. There was Zabar had one on the market. And then I remember Goldberg had one years later on, it was on Richmond Road, I think.
Wellington.
On Wellington Street.
Yeah.
So it's, and in those days, the Jewish population might have been a third of what it is today, and the 4 or 5 butchers who were in business all somehow managed to make a living. And today, with 3 times the number of Jewish people in town, not one butcher seems to be able to survive and do well. There was Lang the Barber on Clarence Street. I don't think there were many Jewish barbers at the time, but then there was George Goldberg, who had a ladies' beauty salon on Rideau Street. There was Dane had the grocery store. Then there were grocery stores almost every corner. There was the Dane family had one on Rideau Street. It didn't matter how old the stuff was in there. They always guaranteed you it was fresh, just came in that morning. There was Markovich had a store on at the corner of Friel and Murray. There was Farber had a store at the corner of York and Friel Street. And I'm sure there were many others. I guess maybe I'm too young to remember some of them. But this was particularly predominant in Lower Town. When I say Lower Town, I'm talking below Rideau Street. That was where I believe, many of the Jewish people, when they first came to Ottawa, that's where they first settled, because that's where unsere Menschen were, where their own people lived, and where they could be comfortable because they could find somebody else to talk Yiddish to, or Polish, or Russische. Because most of the people who lived there had done the same thing before them. They had also come off the boat, whatever, and settled in that part of the city. And the more affluent people lived in Sandy Hill. There may have been a few in the West End, but I think that was very minimal at that time. But there were a number of affluent people in the Sandy Hill area. And of course, nobody had kosher restaurants. And I don't think in those days people ate out very much, because number one, there weren't kosher restaurants and people kept kosher, and secondly, people were still very careful with the dollar in those times. People entertained at home. I remember even after first getting married, my wife and I, boy and I, always had company at home. It didn't seem to be an effort. Now it's an effort to have people over on a Saturday night. But life was beautiful. It's the memories are just phenomenal of those days. I still reminisce about the downtown area of Ottawa in the I guess it was the late, well, it was from many, many years ago until the last, I guess, 20 years, when all things sort of started to change when Freeman sold out to the Bay. But before that, it was like going down it would be like being on the east side of New York practically. The only difference was that everybody wasn't from, and everybody didn't wear every shop owner didn't wear a hat and so on. But it was just great, and you could walk into many of the stores and you'd know the owners, or they'd know you, and how are mom and dad, and my God, you've grown, and so on. We also had the Jewish Community Center, which in those days was at 151 Chapel Street, and where a lot of shidduchs were made, where a lot of good friendships were developed. I remember as a kid going there for Sunday Fun Day, and Abe Nadrich and his family had a hot dog stand down in the basement, and it was that was a focal point of the Ottawa Jewish community. And I remember to this day when they laid the cornerstone for the Beth Shalom Shul, the late Mr. Freeman, and it was just such fond memories of Ottawa. As I say, I'm repeating myself, but you could walk down Rita Street and you had everybody, every kind of store and every store. Whether it was a bakery, it was the corner store, it was a clothing store, a fabric store. You had everybody in business in downtown Ottawa. And nobody complained because there wasn't a lot of parking. You took a streetcar. It was safe to walk at nights. And during the holidays, you certainly didn't have to worry about it. But one of the, and I'm repeating it, but one of the really nice things was when came the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and you could walk downtown and 95% of the stores were closed. It was a sign of respect we had for ourselves, and I can assure you that the non-Jewish people respected us for following that trait. It's a pity that things have changed, but that's life. As I say, at that time, Beth Shalom was built, and it opened in 1956. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur were the first services, because I had my bar mitzvah the week before Rosh Hashanah that year, and it was the last Shabbos in the old King Street Shul, which was the Adath Yeshurun Shul, and eventually became the Jewish Community Funeral Chapel. Machziki Agadas, which was a couple blocks further down north on Murray Street, was Laurie Greenberg at the time was the mayor of Ottawa, and with his help, the city expropriated that corner. That led to Machziki building a new shul in Alta Vista, and there was the old Rita Street Shul, Agudath Israel, not Agudath Israel, Agudath Achim, which was on Rita Street, right near Chapel, and it eventually was just torn down. It's sad to see it go. But they say that's progress, and we have to accept that. I think every doctor and every dentist in town was, or many of them were Jewish then. And I don't want to insult anybody by leaving anybody out. There was Dr. Schechter, Dr. Fireman, Dr. Mercy, goodness, so many more. There was Dr. Sloan as dentist. There was, then eventually a lot of younger men became dentists. Dr. Dover, who was, I think, the first Jewish doctor in Ottawa, and he became first Jewish coroner in town. Actually, he's the one who delivered me at when I was born. His family was very, very respected family here in the city of Ottawa for many years prior to him becoming a dentist. There are just so many fond memories. There was a Dover hardware store which was owned by a brother and son of late Dr. Dover. Jerry Dover and his father. There's Toronto Hardware Store on Dalhousie Street, which was an institution in itself. I mean, they had everything in the world there. How they ever took stock inventory, I don't know. And the owner, Mr. Toronto, Joe Toronto, was such a fine gentleman. There was Zipman's Candy and Gelman's Candy, both on Dalhousie Street. And you'd go in there, and you're a little boy chick or a little girl chick, and they here, nem for the kinder. You'd get some sweets. Unfortunately, they're gone. Their stores are gone. We just don't have any of those places to give us the fond memories or give our children the kind of memories that we were able to gather from these places. I guess if I took more time and had more time to think of so many other stores that were along that area, it was unbelievable. It was just in those days the policemen walked the beat, and they were always friendly, and if you were a little kid you looked up in awe at them. They'd stop and talk to you. And you were so high, you were like 10 feet tall. It was wonderful. It was there were problems too. There was Anglesey Square, which was down at the foot of Chapel Street, and in the wintertime it was turned into a skating rink, and there was a French Catholic school close by, and if you walked by it, they had a great time calling you anti-Semitic names, and in many cases there were fights broke out because the Jewish kids, those who were brave, weren't going to put up with that baloney, and they'd fight them, and sometimes they were the victors, and sometimes the front ice were the victors. Today, unfortunately, they use guns, so I don't think you fool around as much with them. But especially if you won the fight, boy, you were on top of the world. There was a motel, well, it's still there actually, next door to Beth Shalom, that many people who would drive all year wouldn't drive on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and you had to book early if you wanted a hotel room to stay there over the high, especially Yom Kippur. That was the highlight. People would go to Kol Nidre and sleep overnight there at the motel, where you had to book early because it would get sold out very quickly. There was Mickenberg's Delicatessen Deli on Rideau Street between Nelson and Friel, and that was you got a wonderful sandwich there. And if you were rich and had a car and you wanted to drive further out, you could go to Cardish's on Wellington. But Mickenberg's was a great place to go in. It was a long, skinny store, and he always served you a fresh sandwich, and he always told you the bread was fresh. It was wonderful. And if not, he'd run across or send you across the street to Rideau Bakery to get a fresh bread. It was really great in those days. You'd walk up Chapel Street on the other side, heading south, and there were Jewish. There was the Pedagorskys lived on Chapel, and then there was the apartment building that Martin Levinson owned at 210 Chapel, and 265 Daly was Pedagorskys building, the Beverly. There was the La Paloma restaurant, which is one of the fancier restaurants in its heyday, that was owned by the Florence family. It was at the corner of Nelson and Rideau Street. There further down the street there's Nate's, which has been there for a number of years. It's not kosher, but it's a gathering place too, where a lot of the Jewish people get together there for a cup of coffee or a meal. And trying to think, there's so many things that I want to think about. What can I say?
What clubs did you belong to, or were there?
Well, there were a number in the JCC. There was AZA, there was Alps, which I belonged to, for the boys. There was B'nai B'rith, which the girls had, and the boys tried to organize a chapter in my time, but it never was very successful. The girls had B'nai B'rith. They had National Women's had a young group for teenage girls. There was the JCC ran a day camp. We had Camp B'nai B'rith, which was at Quillon, which was about 35 miles outside of Ottawa on the Quebec side, and it was always a drawing card. I remember as a kid, my father had to apply for a subsidy because he couldn't afford to pay for the full rate. And believe me, it wasn't a lot of money in those days, but in those days, a lot of people just didn't have the dollars to throw around. When I started Hillel Academy or the Ottawa Jewish Day School, it was $10 a month is what they charged. And there were a couple of parents who couldn't afford the $10 a month, so they paid $7 a month or whatever they could afford until things got better for them. And I remember going downstairs in the old school, where we had our gym mats and so on, and you'd see mice running by and so on, and you'd scream a little bit, but you got over it and you went back to your class. And we were glad to go home at 3:30 or 4 o'clock when we'd see the Talmud kids coming to school, and we wouldn't laugh in their faces, we'd laugh behind their backs and say they're just starting and we're just finishing our day. But there were different reasons why different kids went to day school and different kids didn't go to day school. But the important thing, I guess, was that everybody got somewhat of a Jewish education in those days. Some maybe a little bit more than others. As I say, most of the families lived in either Lower Town or Sandy Hill at that time, so you really didn't have to look far to go. If you wanted to spend an afternoon at a friend's after school, you didn't have far to go usually. School was so close to home that some of us even were picked up and taken home for lunch. My mother used to pick my brother and myself up, take us home for a home-cooked lunch, and then we'd walk back to school and we'd do all that in whatever it was, 45 minutes or so, and still have a few minutes to play in the backyard at school. It was fun. It was an easy life in those days. Families that had cars were more fortunate. Those of us who didn't have cars would take picnics and go out to Britannia or to Rockcliffe Park, where they have a great park. In the summertime, it was beautiful in both places. Or Heaney Park had a hill. We used to go either for picnics in the summer or slide down on toboggans in the winter. Late Uncle Irving Rivers used to take us. We had a family had an army toboggan. Came along, and while I wasn't around when the war started, I know it was hard on the stories I've heard. It was hard on everybody. I look at the wall plaque on at the shul, and I see all the Jewish boys from Ottawa who went to war, some who unfortunately didn't come back. Thankfully, many did come back. And those families who suffered losses or suffered injuries, to this day, I'm sure still suffer. I was born on August 19th, 1943, and at the time, my father was not called up because he was in the junk business, and he was providing, I guess, a service to the government in collecting all kinds of junk, which they melted down and turned into war machinery. So in that respect, he was spared. One of his younger brothers, did serve in the Air Force, and was not called overseas. I was born in 43, and I guess by the time I was old enough to understand anything, the war certainly was over, and I guess life was returning to a certain normalcy, and the community was growing, both the Jewish and the non-Jewish, and there are some families, some people who had made a lot of money during the war, and I guess they showed it in their way of living and so on. In any event, the Jewish community of Ottawa seemed to be growing. From reading past histories of it, certainly the numbers had started to dramatically increase. The Jewish community itself was certainly growing. I went to Hillel Academy, as I mentioned earlier, which was the Ottawa Hebrew Day School at the time. My brother followed me. When I finished in June of 1956, I went to Lisgar Collegiate for 5 years, and was lucky enough to be preceded by our new Governor General. She was in grade 13 when I was in grade 9. Adrian, in those days it was Adrian Poy, then she became Adrian Clarkson. It was, I'm trying to think who else, what other celebrity, Rich Little was at Lisgar at the time. Stephen Victor, of course, was at Lisgar at the time. That's just a joke. There were a lot of people at Lisgar who became very prominent citizens of Ottawa, of Canada, of the world. The teachers I had in those days I think they were all in their 60s and 70s, and it seems that by the time my children started school, there were no old teachers left, and they were all kids that I went to school with were doing the teaching. So I guess in that number of years, the whole thing turned around. I had teachers like Mr. Waddell for geography. I had Mr. Proctor for English. I had Miss Meach at one time for English. I had Walter Mann at one time for English. English wasn't my favorite subject. Somehow I just seemed to have these teachers. And many others that, if I talked to anybody else, any old alumni or other alumni, were lucky enough to have most of these teachers as well at some point in their high school career. After high school, I had made up my mind that I wanted to go into business with my parents. They had a gift in China jewelry store. They discouraged me. They wanted me to become a professional of some kind, but of course, at 18 years old, what do parents know? Children know everything. And I didn't want to go on to school. In any event, I did go to Sir George Williams School of Retailing in Montreal for 2 years. It was a 2-year course that I took, and got a diploma in retailing, which really isn't worth a hell of a lot. But then I did come back to Ottawa, and I worked with my parents for a number of years until my parents decided to retire. And by then I was married. I got married in August of 1970, and I had 2 young children who used to call me. By then the stores were open evenings, and my little, I guess he was about 5 or 6 years old, would call and say, "Daddy, aren't you coming home for supper?" Or "It's Friday night, we have to make kiddish," and so on. So I decided that whatever life held for me, I could somehow manage to make a living doing something that I'd have a little more family time. Coincidentally, one day I had taken my son to school and bumped into High Hotchburg at the Jewish Community Center, because part of Hillel Academy was in the JCC at the time, and High offered me a job working with him in UJA. Anyhow, after discussing with my wife, I agreed to accept that position. I forgot to mention that I'm married to Iboya Hoffman. She was a girl from Hamilton whom I met by going to Israel. I went on a trip to Israel in 1965. I was about 21 at the time. I went on a trip to Israel with a group from Agudath Israel, which included Rabbi Friedberg and his family. It included Michael Greenberg, the late Gilbert's son, Bessa's son, Enid Gould, who was Enid Toller's son and Ann Toller's daughter, and David Abramson from Kittytown, and a few others. And we tied up with a group from Toronto and a group from Hamilton. I was put in a room with a boy from Hamilton with whom I became very, very good friends. To this day, we're very good friends. Not only good friends, now we're brothers-in-law, because he was taking out Iboya's sister. They got married, and we got married the year later. So that's how I met Iboya, and she's given me 2 beautiful children who are both married, living in Toronto. Our son, Sean, who is 28, is a chartered accountant, and got married a year ago to a girl from Buffalo, whom he met at Camp Ramah in Huntsville, and she graduated this May as a dentist. So now they are living in Toronto. And my daughter is married to a Toronto boy from a very fine family, and they have a little son, 2.5, Noah, who was named after after Sean's grandfather and my late Uncle Irving. Coincidentally, both our son and son-in-law's names are Sean. And what was I saying? So, oh yes, anyhow, I got this job working for the UJA, and I was with the VOD, which is the Jewish Community Council of Ottawa, for 18 years. I spent the first 10 years working with UJA, working my way up from a clerk to the director of Ottawa UJA campaign. Let me tell you, I put in lots and lots of hours because that's what it requires. It's a thankless job, but it's the only way the community can survive is by the dollars being raised by volunteers. And the job of the director was to ensure that there were volunteers available, that the volunteers were knowledgeable in the product that they were selling. And we were relatively successful over the years. Of course, one never can raise enough money, but one tries. When I turned 40, which was in 1983, the following January I took sick, and I'm not going to go into it, but I developed heart problems. And after the 10 years in UJA, I was starting to have many major problems again. So the kindness of the VOD was that they said they would keep me on in a different position, but not put me through the torment of having to work day and night with UJA. So I became the assistant director of the foundation, the endowment, and the Jewish Community Foundation. And I was there for 8 years until my health deteriorated to the point where doctors ordered me to stop working. I worked with wonderful people. I worked with Casey Swedlove in the Endowment Foundation. And to tell you that Casey is a gentleman is just putting it very, very mildly. For those of you who may not be aware, the foundation is an institution where people put in money, bulks of money, to set up a foundation. They add to it by sending out donation cards, etc., through the years. And the money is invested, and there's a board of directors and a group of financial advisors who use the interest. The money is invested, and only the interest is distributed annually. In other words, that capital stays there and will be there for a lifetime. And the interest is distributed, and the hope is that there will be enough foundations and enough dollars coming from the foundation through the interest earned that someday it will cover all the loopholes and all the shortfallings required in the community. For example, for Hilla Lodge never has enough money, camps never have enough money, schools are always short money, the Jewish Community Center is short money, and the hope is that someday there will be enough money raised through the foundation without touching the capital. I believe this past year there was about $500,000 interest earned that was distributed. And if that can be raised to a couple million someday down the road, it'll be the lifesaver of the community. The community, as I say, has suffered, has gone through many, many ups and downs. Things have happened that the community in general is not aware of, because why worry everybody? There's enough worry for those who are looking after the problems. We've had, just to name a few, problems of not raising enough money is probably first and foremost. I remember one year on a Friday afternoon, we got a call at the offices about cemetery that about 50 or 60 Mitzvahs, tombstones, had been knocked over. Some were totally ruined, some were just partially damaged. So here's Friday. Luckily it was during the summer, and about 4:30, a group of us drove out to the cemetery. The police met us there, and there was a lot, not much could be done Friday because it was Erev Shabbos, but the next week or two, everything else sort of was put aside, and the concentration was on repairing the stones and causing the least amount of publicity possible. I mean, it certainly does have some publicity value, but on the other hand, it might have more value than we need. So that's an instance or an example of we've had VIPs coming to speak, and we have a meeting at 7 o'clock, and somebody goes out to the airport. Very often it was me. Would go to the airport because they were coming in on a 5:30 plane, only to arrive at the airport and be told that, oh, that plane hasn't left its home port yet, and it may not be until 8 or 9 o'clock tonight. And back in my mind, my God, there's a meeting in an hour and a half. Who's going to talk? In any event, these were some of the exciting moments that you live through, and you come to the end of a campaign, or you come to the end of a year of foundation, and you see how things manage to get done, and you find a substitute to fill in, and so on. The recent bulletin that we just received, the headlines on the front page was the issue of the JCC opening on Shabbat. That's a question that I guess they are dealing with now, and now that I'm away from the scene, I don't know the intimate details, but from a personal perspective, I think it's a very sad thing that a Jewish institution should be open on the Sabbath, just as I don't agree with the prospect of having non-Jewish members. I think one of the reasons the Jewish Community Center was built 40-some years ago was so that our Jewish children would meet other Jewish children, and that way we would keep our Jewish children together. Now that it's open to membership, I realize the financial part of it, but somehow there has to be another answer, and of course, but I'm not part of that. And I hope that there are some people and voices that are strong enough that will be able to prevent some of these issues happening. I've traveled, not a great deal, but I have been to conferences in other major American cities. I've been to Montreal and Toronto, and I can proudly say that Ottawa has nothing to be ashamed about. We are and I can't speak as much today as I can about 10 years ago when I was more actively involved in the community. But the community is, certainly was, one of the strongest communities on a per capita basis. It had great leadership. It had High Hochberg at the head of the helm as the executive vice president, who directed every day's day-to-day affairs, and who was a master at keeping everybody on the right tracks in the right lane of traffic. And the community, I think people who've lived here for all their lives, or for much of their lives, don't realize what a great community, what a strong community, and a viable community we have here in Ottawa. And somehow I think they have to be made aware of what a wonderful community we have. And I don't know what the avenue or what voice should be used to let them be made aware. We have so many organizations that are great, like the Jewish Historical Society is doing a service to the community that 50 years down the road we'll all get on our hands and knees and thank them for doing. The Endowment and Foundation, the UJA, which hopefully will get stronger, but our other organizations, Hillel Lodge, which is moving into new quarters very shortly, our day school, Hillel Academy, which started with 13 kids in 1949, and now I think has between 400 and 500 children in the school. The Talmud Torah is still, I think, a very strong school, modern Jewish school. Camp B'nai B'rith, the day camp, JCC day camp. We've got lots to be grateful for, but we can't let our guard down, I don't think. I think so we want our children to be able to say what a great community their parents and grandparents have provided them with. And it's only going to be done if everybody keeps working. I don't want to preach, but it's very, very important that we all participate and we all just keep working at it, keep the shuls active, keep the schools active.
I'm going to put you on the spot now, Howie, in talking and conducting these interviews. After all is completed, sometimes we sit and chat, and invariably a very, very favorite theme crops up. Oh, if I could only do the following, or I'd love to go there, or I'd like to do or see or have, and so on. So, off the top of your head, what would you like to do or see or have in the near future? All things being okay.
You talking about me, myself?
Yeah.
Well, I would like to be able to do some volunteer work. I'd like to, just for example, on Shul on Shabbos, the rabbi asked for volunteers for Jewish Family Services, deliver Meals on Wheels. Apparently they're having a problem. I'd love to be in the position where I could put my arm up and say, I'll be glad to deliver meals. It's something my late father and my mother, who still does certain things in the community, did for a number of years. My father did it when he was 80 years old, and I'd like to be able to do it at any time. I would like to be able to go to Hillel Lodge and help out those who need help. I'd like to do a little more volunteer work for my shul. I did for many years. I've had to stop. I'd like to be able to do a little more again.
Well, you're being very modest. You did more than just volunteer at Marziki. You were also the president at the growing stage.
Well, that was a pleasure. It was a delight to work with the people of the shul, a delight to work with Rabbi Bulka. And the community is just a wonderful community. I can't say enough about it. And I should certainly want to extend thanks to Joe Murray for taking on this responsibility of speaking to people. It's not the easiest thing in the world either to line them up and get appointments arranged with them. So it's very important for. Here's a guy who many years ago I don't think was terribly active in the community. He was busy earning a living, working hard as a teacher and a principal. And now that he's at the stage of life where he can take it easier, he's devoted a lot of time to the community the last few years, and I think it's wonderful. And I'm sure there are I won't say hundreds, but there's got to be dozens and dozens of people out there who, even if they golf in the summer, could do it in the winter, or vice versa, or go away in the winter and they're home in the summer, could do it in the summer. I mean, you can't expect the same volunteers to do it for years and years and years. Pay is not very, very exciting. But the reward is the satisfaction that one can get from doing these things.
I think I'm going to quit now while I'm ahead with such complimentary endings. This tape has to be a keeper. Thank you again, Howie.
My pleasure.